You talked a lot about the sort of, I'm fascinated to hear about the kind of idea of finding your language. There's a lot of talk about that now. Sorry, I'll stand up. About finding your language and the struggle between, there's a quote there, between the struggle always between the language of experience and the language of theory. And then you finished up by saying that we don't always speak as one voice. What strikes me at the moment as well, particularly, is that for my generation and below, because I'm like mid-30s, you were talking about the struggle in the kind of wave before now was about finding female empowerment as individuals. We are very used to seeing ourselves as individuals, but less used to seeing ourselves as a collective. And I feel like feminism can only progress. We've almost regressed because we're having to refine that sense of collectivism. So what, it's not a very well-formed question, but I suppose what experience do you have in creating that collective? What advice do you have for younger feminists in finding that collective again and using that for the kind of good of the movement, I suppose? Thank you.
Thank you. Lots of issues there. Thanks very much. Does anybody else want to contribute at this point? Okay, well, Lynne, do you want to take that big question?
Well, you can see there's a little bit of collectivity going on here. I don't think that's just individuals coming together. But you're right. I mean, the whole this culture of individualism is so strong. We've had to appoint a czar of loneliness to teach us how not to be lonely. Although they're looking for a pill now to try and cure loneliness. So the idea that what we should be getting together is coming together in resistance is not the first thought that comes to many people today. But there really are groups. The groups that always get quoted, Sisters Uncut, women who have been abused, who come together demanding resources against for better housing for themselves and against domestic violence and so on. There's been all these things that were being funded, like shelters for battered women and so on. All these things have been defunded lately. Or the E15 mothers, those women whose housing was being knocked down, who are saying, women need better housing. Again, exactly a struggle that we were engaged in the 1970s. So the struggles are there. What I didn't get time to talk about, which is really interesting, is, I said that women's liberation coming out of the 60s is very much about direct action. It's about politics from below. Now the problem is that's always best at certain moments, and it's not just in good times. It might, you might be coming out, against particular issues and so on, as in 2011 or as with the election of Trump and so on. The problem is that in difficult times, as there's more and more pressure for people to be working longer in jobs, as so many pressures around housing and everything else, how that gets sustained, it seems to me, is very difficult. So while I think that supporting movement struggles of any progressive sort actually is important, and obviously all the green struggles going on now, all the tree huggers and stopping road builders and so on, all those crucial struggles. But for me, I want, and in fact I've been wanting since '79, a link through to more mainstream politics, which is why I'm now in the Labour Party. You don't have to be in the Labour Party, but to pay some attention to what's going on, to what it means to have a socialist leader of the Labour Party, rather than spending your time slagging him off, as most of my friends are. Many of my feminist friends spend their time slagging off Corbyn in the Labour leadership, actually, which I find pretty extraordinary. Rather than thinking, you don't have to join the Labour Party, that's fine, but you have to think of how to get the most progressive party in government that you can, in order to get your national and regional and international bodies that are going to give more space, to allow the resistance to continue. Or you'll have a decade like the 1990s, which was the most quiet and silent decade, when after second decade after Thatcher, and we still haven't got rid of her, You know, the only real struggle going on then was the HIV/AIDS struggle, the growth of queer politics. There wasn't a lot else that was happening in that decade. So I think you have to work on many fronts at once.
Right. Okay, there's one.
It's quite broad. It's quite broad, but what do you think the biggest problem or issue women are facing right now that's hindering employers?
What are the main issues, problems they're facing? Yes, absolutely. That's a
Okay,
good
thanks
question.
very much. Okay, there was another back there. Was there somebody else?
There's one here.
Okay, sorry, I saw another hand. Yeah, go ahead.
Actually, you talked about, focused on the United States and Britain,
Yeah.
but anything about women in France in 60s,
Right.
it should be very different.
Yes, it was very different.
That's good, thanks. We take one more, shall we? And then we're going. If there is somebody else want to raise. Okay, well there's two. Okay, Lynn.
What are the main struggles of women? I mean, many people think that the main struggle for women is fighting against issues of violence, against domestic violence and rape and so on, which certainly continues and globally, is a huge issue. I don't think that should push aside other issues and why it is that so many women remain so vulnerable in the world. And we said I'm working on care now, and I'm working on care now because that seems to me the one issue we've got nowhere near solving. While up to a point there's certainly a language of giving women more rights in the workplace, and a language actually against violence against women and so on. What we've seen is where resources are needed to do the work that women traditionally did, which is the labours of love, which is care work. That's where we've completely regressed, because welfare has been withdrawn at the very time that women have to work even longer hours in the workforce, even when they've got young children or other domestic responsibilities, caring for older people, or just wanting to keep their communities alive. And what's happened is the outsourcing. Just as we've outsourced the state and the resources we own, so we've actually outsourced that work of care. So many women, even poor women who can, to get a job, will be getting their mothers, getting the granny brigade, or else, of course, trying to get in some au pair, some very cheap labour, usually women's labour, from the third world. So I think struggles around care are absolutely crucial, alongside of those struggles against violence and other things, but struggles around care, and to rethink why care itself is so denigrated, which I think is to do with the whole mantra of autonomy that these sort of time of neoliberal or absolute capitalism, whatever we want to say, where the market's been allowed to invade everywhere, and people's needs and our dependencies, which we all have, are just shunted off as unimportant issues. Feminism began by beginning to say this is central. Who cares for the children is central. What happens in the home is central. And that's what's got sidelined, and that's what we've got to bring back and make central, it seems to me. In terms of what was going on in the rest of the world, it's interesting how different the same sorts of struggles are everywhere around the world, and I am only really knowledgeable and read a lot about British and American struggles. And then, of course, for teaching I read theory, so I read feminist theory, which often very much comes from France. And in France it's interesting because there is a high theoreticism there, where the stress on sexual difference is one of the first places to be theoretically emphasising Irigaray, Sixties and Christeva, emphasising the importance of sexual difference. And that's also the same in France, in Italy. And it's interesting because de Beauvoir was so critical for the formation of women's liberation, but in France, interestingly and oddly, the Beauvoir comes to be rejected, and rejected in particular by those feminist theorists who want to emphasise difference and think that reclaiming the feminine should be one of the main goals of what feminists do. Now, there were other people, Christine Delphi and others, who didn't agree with that perspective, but it seems to me that the grassroots struggles seem to even faster get overtaken by a type of emphasis on subjectivity and theory in France. But I'm sure there are lots of grassroots struggles which women are at the centre of, and what that leads to as well is to be involved in struggles in support of women. You don't have to declare yourself a feminist, you mightn't even see yourself as a feminist, particularly as a lot of people think feminism's about man-hating or feminism's about, I mean, I don't care if women call themselves feminists or not, but I do care that they're interested in, and usually they say they are interested in, women's equality, and they oppose violence against women. There's a problem because, a lot of the, interestingly and oddly, a lot of the some of the new right leaders are women in Germany, in France, and elsewhere, and they do use some of this sort of appropriated feminism, we're tough women, to get them into leadership positions. And so I think I can only answer you by saying that feminism has become a very complex animal now, and what I suppose I see myself as doing is trying to reclaim certain feminist voices that were absolutely concerned with issues of equality, with transforming the world. It was a transformational politics. It was a transformational politics that involved men as well as women, and that's where I stand, and that's what I want to encourage.
Okay. Who else? Okay.
You wrote a book called Straight Sex, I think around 1990, and I think the argument you were making, I hope I'm not getting it wrong, is a polemic, if you like, in defence of heterosexual feminists, because you felt that lesbianism had become a kind of norm within the women's movement, or a standard, or something. And so I wanted to ask you to fill in the gap, because in what you were talking about in the 60s and 70s, you spoke about heterosexual women's experience, but you didn't mention lesbian women's experience. So presumably at that point the experience of lesbian women is fairly marginal. By 1990 the experience of lesbian women has become normative in feminism, and so I wondered if you could talk about what happened in between and that overlap between gay liberation and feminism.
Well, there's many people in the audience who could answer that question better than me, but I can. And you can see if there's any other questions.
No, absolutely. Any other questions or points around this issue? Somebody
Or
wants
any
to.
issue.
Anybody who hasn't? No. Okay. Oh, there. Sorry. Yes.
Given that the non-aligned movement in the 60s was largely led by men, like Stefano, Taito, Nkrumah, Nasser, and so on, various people, what role did women have in the anti-imperial struggle during the 60s, especially in the Third World?
Right. Thanks. That's a good question. Okay. Do you want to let one more, Lynne, and you've got a passel full.
It almost runs on from your question, because I had a question about this. Obviously, the idea of intersectionality is so key to the feminist movement at the moment, and presumably always has been, albeit with a different language. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what that looked like in the 60s and how people intersected in the feminist movement in the 60s and 70s.
Okay, great, thanks.
Well, as I said, people could talk about straight sex and dissident sexualities, as we sometimes call it, or radical sexualities, or open, liberated sexualities, perhaps better than I can. But from the beginning, interestingly and perhaps oddly, one of the first struggles within women's liberation was lesbians saying that women's liberation was not all about straight women. That happens very early on, in the early 70s. You get those battles with particularly the most liberal forms of feminism then, like now in the US. We didn't have quite that sort of liberal feminism here. We tended to be a bit more radical, though there probably were some, but I wasn't involved in that. So lesbianism was always, early on, emerges as a voice that we should take notice of. What I think happens by the end of the 1970s, connected to the question of intersectionality, though we didn't call it intersectionality yet, we talked about multiple oppression, and some of the early feminist writings, and in particular Sheila's writing, which I know best, was always emphasising that we cannot speak for all women. We can only talk about our own experience. We can show solidarity with all women, and so there are multiple oppressions of class, of race, of able-bodiedness. All these came to the fore. What I think happens is, as that confident moment in the early 1970s starts to be beaten back, we really have a lot of victories. We keep hospitals open, we get funding for nurseries. The women's magazines like Spare Rib that Ruthie worked on, are flourishing. A lot of things are flourishing. But by the end of the 70s, facing the rise of the right, facing Thatcher, there is much more of a retreat of left politics generally. And I meant to emphasise, and I hope I did emphasise, that women's liberation grows out of the left. It grows out of the left. It is against it, and often strongly against it, like Robin Morgan, goodbye to all that, and Robin Morgan will become a strong, radical feminist voice, as distinct from someone like me who becomes a socialist feminist voice, in which I'm always going to be stressing the importance of social transformation and class and other struggles alongside feminism. So in the 80s we start talking about intersectionality. But what happens, and a problem with identity politics that many people stress today, and by identity politics I just mean organising around your own oppression. You actually have to organise around your own oppression. Nobody else is going to until you do. So you can't just dismiss identity politics. But the problem can be that you get into oppression Olympics. Who is the most oppressed? And in discussing who is the most oppressed, you often end up attacking precisely those people who are closest to you. So it's precisely in Feminist Review, on Spare Rib, in women's studies departments, that I'm sick of hearing from whitey women, I'm sick of hearing from you able-bodied women, I'm sick of hearing, And so that's when things start to get very difficult. And by the way, I think this is a problem of movement politics. Now there's a problem of party politics or the organised left politics. You get your leader and your top down, and it can survive. It can survive, but you're likely to have bullying or worse that we know went on in some of the Leninist groups, the WRP, the SWP, and so on. But the problem for movement politics isn't just that they can more easily begin to disappear, but the struggles between people, can be harder and harder to mediate. The generosity and openness that all politics needs, that all politics must have, solidarity being the most important basis for political activity, that can somehow get swamped by saying, our voice isn't being heard. And usually when our voice isn't being heard, you actually know that voice is being heard. That voice usually is being heard, and other voices are not being heard, actually. So there's always going to be a new struggle emerging, and how one deals with that is an incredibly demanding issue for movement politics, and why it can sometimes actually be a relief to be in a more mainstream organisation where everybody isn't screaming about at everybody else in quite the same way, although I believe some Labour Party wards are very tense and unpleasant, fortunately. Not mine yet. So that was the second question. The third question about anti-imperialism. Women were absolutely involved in anti-imperial struggle. I mean, nowhere more so, for instance, than in Ireland. Everybody I know that involved in troops out, trying to get the troops out of Ireland, they were all women, and in Ireland as well, the leaders, and some of them, you know, the most creative leaders of trying to get the British out of Ireland were women. But you know, Angela Davis, I mean, there were, of course, women involved in anti-imperial struggle, but those voices were not being heard in the 60s. But I think more recently, if you look at anti-colonial struggles, it's often women leading them, particularly at grassroots level. And that's another reason why you don't hear their name so much, because it is at grassroots level. So, you know, they're not the ones that are going to end up going to speak at the UN or, you know, in some other big platform, but they are actually leading the struggle on the ground. And I think wherever you looked, you would find that. It doesn't go down in history. You know, women's tracks are still the most easily erased unless, you know, you manage to be one of these more powerful women who insists on getting onto platforms and having their voices heard. You know, women are often racing back home to look after the kids or the parents or something else. So I do think that it is contingent upon women's lives, and that women are still sort of taking up that slack of care work and so on, that you don't hear so much about their political engagement as you might hear about those men who have more time to get their voices heard. That's how I would answer that.
Thanks very much. Okay, we have a few people. Simon?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
So this talk tonight, I don't want to interrupt the flow, so we try to be quick. But this talk tonight is part of a series of talks we've had on social histories of revolution, the long 1960s. We've had 5 already. We've got 6 or 7 more to come. There's always been a good crowd like this, and I think what's distinguished it is that we've always had speakers from who are researchers in academia or people who were there at the time in the 60s, or both. And we've had an audience which is not an academic audience, so they're not academic seminars, and the sort of discussion that we've had tonight, I think that's been characteristic of all the talks. So there's a leaflet there if you want more information. There's a sheet which is a bit scraggly going around, but you can put your name and email on it. So just to give you a very, very quick idea of what's coming up. It's once a month, roughly, but not exactly, and there's a website as well, you can check it out, socialhistories.wordpress.com. And the next one is Thursday the 28th of February in SOAS building, the School of Oriental African Studies. That's China and the Cultural Revolution. Steve Smith, somebody who's studied that issue, the Chinese revolutions of the 20th century, but also specifically the so-called Cultural Revolution of the 60s. That's what he's going to talk about next month. And then just to whiz through the other titles to give you a flavour, there's going to be Revolutionary Protest in the Vietnam War Era, Alexander Sedelmeier in March, the 1960s and Gay Liberation, Colin Wilson in April, the Women's Movement in the 60s, a historian's view from Sue Bruley in May, Revolutionary Change in Egypt, Brecht de Smet also in May, and that's specifically the movements around Nasser from the 50s through to the 70s. Socialism and Republicanism in Ireland in the 60s and 70s, Brian Hanley in June, and we finish up with a talk on black power and gender in the United States in the 1960s with Robin Spencer. That's in the first week of July. So it's on the leaflet, or put your name on the sheet, or see me at the end, or Mark, and thank you.
I would like to hear from some of the older feminists here who are around, like Ruthie and Jane and others I see dotted around there. Does anyone want to make a contribution to add to what I've said? You were all very involved.
Okay.
Yeah.
There we are.
more of a comment than a question. I kind of lived that history, but I wasn't part of the feminist movement.
Right.
I was too busy caring.
Yes,
And so
quite.
what I was kind of feelers out, you know, you just
You
had
need to speak up, I can't
Oh,
hear.
sorry,
Yeah.
I beg your pardon. I was just saying, I kind of lived this without actually being part of the feminist movement because I was too busy caring. And I think that's the issue. And I think now there's probably an issue of class, that actually it's women with less money who do so much caring. They don't have time to think or do anything else. And I think this class thing really comes into it, because whilst, I became a professional woman in the end, but many people can't do that. They just get stuck in caring. And I think, there's a huge class issue, I think, in it. And where it is today, I don't know. Kind of sort of getting back in the swim of it.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Anybody else? Yeah.
Could you say who you are?
Why?
No one else. I know. I meant to say that ages ago, but that was the chair should have said that.
Yes, I could have, yes.
My name is Annie Pike, and most of my activity, I think, for a lot of my working life has been in the trade union movement, so that's what I know the most about. I mean, I've obviously been involved in other kinds of feminist initiatives, including stuff like like trying to overthrow anti-abortion laws and that kind of thing, and just whatever happens to come up. But I just wanted to mention the trade union movement because, it hadn't particularly been mentioned much before, but not, I'm sure, because Lynne isn't, interested or aware of that, but it's just what I've mostly been doing. And I think that one point that's worth making is that in the 60s and 70s, there was, just as we're talking about, there's a surge of the left. In the 60s and 70s, there's a great increase in trade union organisation in white-collar type jobs. So there's a huge expansion of trade unionism amongst those, and that then partly means that there's going to be more women than ever before, perhaps, engaged in those things, and refusing sort of to be, stamped down into being just, cannon fodder in that, and wanting to be parts of it. And at the time this was beginning to happen with me, I was working in the book publishing industry, very white collar, and not very blue jeans actually, more than white collar, but it was totally, it was very, very much occupied by women at the lower end of it. And it still is, really. It's very largely done and carried out and organised by women. And now there are some individual women who've reached the top of that industry, but it's still quite a pyramid with women at the bottom, and big pay gaps and so on. But at the time we were getting involved in that and becoming, a lot of us were becoming aware of things like socialist politics and involving ourselves in all sorts of different things. But it was out of a standpoint of wanting to be trade unionists and being inspired by everything we knew about other kinds of trade unionism that had gone on, and still was, in what people probably consider more traditional fields of, historical trade union endeavour, that's kind of more male and hardcore, people might think. But we wanted to do those same things, and we did come across difficulties, for example, with some women in the women's movement who felt that trade unionism was so completely male-dominated, and the TUC and it's the higher echelons of the unions were so male-dominated that there was no point really in women involving themselves in that. And quite a lot of us refused to accept that and kind of battled on. And there was a thing called the Working Women's Charter in the 70s, which was a campaign around, the demands of women who were at work outside the home, which brought in all the matters about how you would deal with the fact that still women were meant to take responsibility for lots of other things within the home, even though they were working outside the home. So it was about pay, but it was also about childcare and all sorts of other things. So, there was a certain amount of success in this, and it has to be said that now there are more women who have a certain amount of influence and more women working within the the trade union movement and in its higher levels, for example at the top of the TUC, but whether that really means, that we have the liberation of women at work, well of course we don't, and we still have huge pay gaps, for example, and all the other things that we need to deal with, and pushing back actually of a lot of workers' power of people at work has meant the pushing back of a lot of things to do with paying conditions as well as pay, which includes all the things that benefit women and care for women at work and helps with their responsibilities at home at the same time. And the casualisation of work and the gig economy, all this stuff is, makes women's lives even harder. But we're still in there trying to fight against those things. So I'm also in a trades union council, which I'm vice president of. That would have been the first trades union council I was a delegate to. It was mostly men, but hardly any women ever said anything in it, including me. It was huge, and I used to go to the meetings in a big place with tiers of seats, and I was so scared of everyone that I refused to ever say anything in it. And I think we've actually moved on a bit from that, but it is still an important area of work for women, I think.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Anybody else?
Yeah,
As suggested by our speaker, would you like to give your name?
all right. Lynne Segal. I feel I was one of the women who came in after you all had started Women's Liberation Movement. I came in about 72 and was immensely inspired. But I don't have enough perspective because I feel like I haven't looked at it historically. I was on the ground, I was a lesbian squatting with women trying to create women's housing, which was incredibly difficult at that time. And I lived in a place where we had our windows smashed by men who hated us every day practically, and had to have perspex put into our windows. So it's like it was quite on the front line, but I haven't got enough perspective on it. But I wanted to say something about the gap that a questioner asked about between when lesbians were marginal and then when Lynne feels that heterosexual women became marginal. And I think, in my perspective, and it is very personal and probably just anecdotal, but I think there was a real problem in the women's liberation movement that the fight for the sixth demand, and there were two sixth demands, but the one I'm talking about was the one that women had the right to define their own sexuality. And we did eventually get it through, but it was a tremendous struggle within women's liberation. And I came into the WLM as a, do you agree with me? Yeah. I came in, I'm just thinking, have I got it all wrong? But I came in as a socialist. I came in from Gay Liberation Front and as a socialist. And I sort of lost my identification as a socialist during that period when we were so struggling and feeling like, why did we have to struggle with our sisters to have the right to define our own sexuality as one of the major demands of the women's liberation movement? And later on I readopted, and I am very strongly a socialist, and I feel I have been all my life, but there was this difficulty in that time. So that's just, I haven't got a good, historical analysis of it, but I think that was a very difficult time within the women's liberation movement. And I'm thinking it was about 74 that it was so difficult, 73, 74. Anyone else got an idea?
I might come to that. I don't know. Okay. Jane Grant. I came here in '65 from the States, and I suppose came from a culture of anti-racism and anti-imperialism rather than class. And I think it's still there in a way. But so I came here in '65, and really up until the Women's Conference in Ruskin, would have called myself... up until the Women's Conference in Ruskin, felt very enmeshed in... I suppose they would be like American New Left politics here. And the Women's Conference just kind of... we formed a women's group afterwards to work out what was that about? And we formed a women's group. We became a consciousness-raising group and sort of exploded in ways that I've recently been researching for a book on the Miss World contest, which may or may not get done, but there's
Oh, it will.
It will. But there's going to be a film about it. So I've been reading recently 60s politics and find some old scraps of paper of mine that are full of metaphors about being busy being born or dying, and many birth metaphors. I later became a midwife. That was a kind of re-entry into the women's movement, because there was a period in between which was lost to things like solidarity with people in prison and things. And for me, one of the huge things was language. And as in the leaflet for the Miss World trial, we're not beautiful, we're not ugly, we're angry. We were always about smashing binaries, problematizing, I suppose, simplified, or could be seen as simplified demands. I think we were a pain to a lot of groups more organized than us. In that community that Linda talks about, the squatters in London Fields, I remember... Oh, okay.
Yeah, but both
London
both
Fields.
of them.
Same.
I was in both.
Okay. Coming out of a pub once, in terms of the antagonism of men, but kind of curiosity as well. I was coming out of a pub with a friend. I couldn't drink. I was pregnant. I'd gone off it for some reason. And someone shouted at us, how do lesbians get pregnant? How do they have babies? And it had been by self-insemination, but I turned to him and said, "There's a new way, don't you know?" And he actually went,
That's nice.
yeah.
That's nice.
Books.
That's nice.
Thanks very much. Okay, and then maybe we'll come back for some final comments. Okay.
Valerie Remy, I thought it was a really great talk then.
Thanks for that.
Brought back an awful lot of memories. There's two things I wanted to bring up. One is about transgender, and the other is about ecofeminism. I came out as a trans woman in December 1972, and then as a lesbian trans woman the following May. It was a very, very difficult climate, because it was precisely at that point that the lesbian separatist thing really got off the ground. I was excluded from most of what feminists did, but not everything, of course. As you remember, Lynn, we used to work together with men on many, many different projects, like in the Libertarian Network newsletter, for instance, and just so many things we worked together on. And then there's Men Against Sexism, of course, which came out of the scene that we were in, the milieu that we were in. But I didn't know of anyone else who was on the left and was trans in the 1970s and early 80s. I mean, there were, I think there were people, but I didn't know them personally. They certainly weren't in the libertarian sort of part of the left. They may have, but there again, I don't remember anyone in the, like, Trotsky's Leninist part of the left either. And I was rejected by GLF. I was told not to come again when I went for a meeting at the LSE. I was told in no uncertain terms, don't come back, we're a respectable organisation. So what the men at least were doing there was within the parameters of the 67 Act, and the achievement of the 67 Gay Rights Act. You know. Sue Bruley, who's mentioned, who's going to give a talk later in the series, interviewed me about 5 years ago, and she wrote a chapter based on our interview about what it felt like to be a woman in the 70s, trans woman, who was excluded from an awful lot, not from everything, how it felt. So, the other thing is ecofeminism. You mentioned it briefly, Lynn. With the eco movement, which I've been involved in for many years. I've been in the Green Party since the mid-1980s, since Chernobyl. And of course, in the Green Party, we've always had a lot of very prominent women. I mean,
Absolutely.
most of the leaders, particularly Caroline Lucas, a really high-profile figure of women, it's often been a problem to get men into high-profile positions, you know, and it's been like that from the start. So, of course, the Green Movement developed contemporaneously with the second wave of the feminist movement and with LGBT, and the Black movement a bit earlier, and so many other things, of course, that come out of '68. And I was an art student at the time at Hornsey College of Art in North London, and it was the time of my life. I mean, it was just incredibly exciting, but there wasn't yet feminism. The earliest feminist activity I remember in North London was in August '69 with the Maoist women, and they were more or less pariahs in relation to where we were at, because we already, most of us identified as sort of autonomists, or people who believed in socialist self-management or whatever. But the eco-movement, of course, you've got Rachel Carson's American biologist, her Silent Spring about pesticides in 1962, and then she dies under mysterious circumstances in '65. It was quite pivotal. But Earth Day in the US, I think, is really crystallises things. And I've now got, I now work closely with several Facebook friends who were involved in that. And that was '71. And then following you have the Club of Rome report, '72. And then that sparks off the formation of Green Party. The first one was in Belgium, and then Germany, and then here and various other countries. But it developed very slowly during the 1970s. And coming back to your talk, Lynn, at what point do you think, I mean, at what point does ecofeminism or green feminism, in the widest sense, not just party political, really start to blossom? And I know you've been involved mainly in the Labour Party, which it says since '79. Before that, it was like...
No, since '79 there was a hiatus of 20 years.
Sorry?
There was a hiatus of 20 years.
Yes.
No, 30.
I don't think in Beyond the Fragments that you and the other authors discussed ecofeminism. It really came into its own, I think, more in the 80s. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah. Thanks very much, and thanks for the contribution.
Okay,
very much. And
that's a lot of things.
Yes, and so maybe some closing remarks, Lynn. Thank you very much.
So we begin with women and caring. As I said, I think that's the issue. I think it always was the issue. And I think violence against women and women as a marginal in the workforce, I think everything comes from, or very closely connects with that division of work between men and women, where the nonsense that men are autonomous and women are dependent, when in fact women are meeting the dependency needs of others, is held in place. And that's what has stayed in place, and that's why I think that remains the main issue of the moment. Now, actually, a lot of those early feminists were mothers. I mean, we're meant to have hated children, but actually many of us were mothers, and that's why we became feminists and were setting up those nursery groups. And, you know, Sheila Rowbotham says mothers were the vanguard of our movement, but not everybody knew. I mean, like, you know, we were somehow managed to be slightly outside of nuclear families, you know, and so the nuclear family was this sort of big constraint to us that's partly taken over from the '60s politics, smash the family and so on, you know, so that we were sort of happily outside of a conventional family, which I think gave us more space within feminism. But I think you're right to stress care. I mean, today there are huge debates around care, it's not only a class issue, though it's absolutely a class issue, it's absolutely a race issue, because it's in particular au pairs and immigrant workers, often illegal, you know, who are doing that work and who can be oppressed and exploited to the extent that they are, precisely because they're immigrant workers, and you know, racism very much comes into it, as well as class. But actually, we haven't solved the problems of caring for any women. And you'll find those women who are leaders of any party, quite simply, usually have no children. They usually have no, or very few. And another friend of mine has just written a book called Returning Home, about middle-class women who can't cope with the demands of work, you know, huge demands of work in professional jobs, you know, and go home to raise their children. And they're back with all the problems that we began with, you know, feeling isolated, feeling lonely, feeling worthless, finding themselves competing with other women. We haven't in any way solved the problems of care. Now today, as oddly, back in the 70s, there was a dispute between wages for housework. The wages sought this was to pay women a wage. For us, then, most of us, and for some of us now, including me, that isn't the solution, although I'm interested in arguments around basic wage and things like that. But to pay wages for housework seems to me to undermine what we've wanted to do, which is say everyone must be involved in caring work, men and women alike, on the one hand, and on the other hand, caring is the most important work that happens in society, and by the way, might end up the main work which we're doing, that's the huge expansion of work, is in caring work. And as machines and other other forms of automation replace many of the jobs we're in, it's those hands-on caring jobs which are going to still remain, and that's where the big expansion of jobs in the US here and no doubt elsewhere is occurring. So, you know, caring, I think, is just such a huge issue at the moment. So I won't keep going on about that, but there's so much to say. On trade unions, we were engaged in trade unions. As I said, that first campaign was the night cleaners campaign about unionising the night cleaners. Still goes on today, about unionising nursery workers and others. And as you say, then it was mainly people leading that Working Women's Charter campaign were mainly coming from IMG or some of the women in the small organised left groups. But most of us were supporting it. We always had a problem, I think, we who were more libertarian feminists wanting to say, it's not just the workplace, you must always think about the community, and you're always wanting that tie-up between the community and the workplace, and always worried that what has happened might happen, that the workplace becomes the site of struggle, and the home, and what women do in the home somehow becomes secondary. So we were so concerned not to let that happen. But so there's still a lot of discussion about how we're going to move forward in terms of getting a new language of care, a new language of dependency, showing that the idea of a polarity between autonomy and dependence is absurd. You know, we all depend on each other all the time for everything. So yes, trade union struggles are crucial, and they must be linked to other struggles. And of course, it was in '76, I think, that the attempt to beat back some of the reproductive rights women had, and the campaign then to preserve abortion rights, involved the trade union movement in '76. So that was the first huge alliance here between the leaders of trade unions and the rank and file of trade unions and women's liberation. So that, you know, there was work that was going on. Women's housing and sexuality. There's so much more I can say about sexuality. I mean, I haven't said anything really. And you might be able to define your sexuality, but I don't find it so easy to define my sexuality, as a matter of fact. I mean, I think that it's a very complicated issue, and it got so affect-laden, and you know, there was huge disagreements between lesbians. I mean, actually, women, most of them, apart from me, actually, gave up talking about straight sex, and that was lesbians arguing about, you know, our sexuality isn't about politics. We don't love women because we don't want to engage with men. We love women because we're lesbians because we love women, not because we, you know, don't think we should want to be together with men. So there was a huge battle within the lesbian feminist movement between, you know, they didn't agree on how to define their sexuality. They didn't agree on how to define many things, actually, and sexuality will never be easy to define. On trans politics, you surely knew Ros Caveney.
No, I didn't.
You didn't? Oh.
We've had lots of conversations about it.
Oh.
And
because she was so much around.
You know Ros Caveney about 10 years ago.
Oh, okay.
She was, in inverted commas, a gay man when John Swearman's notorious transsexual.
I thought she was around much earlier than that.
In 79.
She thinks she was.
No, in inverted commas, but she wasn't in our.
Well, you'll have to battle that out with her.
But she wasn't in our circle, was she?
And there was, I don't know, there was someone else called Carol something. Waddell, yeah, Carol Waddell, yeah, that's it. I thought it was that, Carol Waddell, and I thought I might have mixed up with Margaret, which wouldn't have been right. So, but you're right. I mean, people didn't know how to factor that in to their politics, and they so obviously still don't. You know, there is a terrible battle going on, as you know, around the Gender Recognition Act. Yes, and so I think various people in the room, and unfortunately on different sides. So there's a big battle going on, which I could say plenty about, but I think that there isn't time probably to open that one up. I was noticing what you said, Jane, but I think that was complete in and of itself on eco-politics. I think that the women's peace movement was quite involved in eco-politics, but not by that name. I mean, often, you know, names names have their moment, don't they? And so I think that peace politics was very concerned with the environment, and so women at Greenham, you know, wanted to live off the land and do all sorts of things that were absolutely about the ANCAS and, you know, loving nature and so on. But it doesn't here. It developed earlier, I think, in Germany, the green politics. But here, I think you're right, only become aware of it a few decades later, really, when it's formalised as the Green Party. But it's when I said, you know, not everyone calls themselves a feminist. I mean, I think we get involved in all sorts of different battles, and that doesn't mean that, you know, politics itself is our political label. They're labels, you know, and how we label ourselves politically is partly just what, you know, what groups we're among, what we come across, you know, what our counterculture is. And so you'll have all sorts of people fighting all sorts of issues without calling themselves, you know, involved in green politics or involved in feminist politics. But there's you know, you can see that actually is a part of their concern. So I wish that people would get less hung up on the labels, and then we might get less sectarian battles, actually, if we could be less hung up on the labels and more concerned about the issues, and the issues where we began, of equality, of care, of trust, of openness, of wanting a politics that goes way beyond any party politics, to see that power and exploitation and oppression can go on everywhere in life. You know, a politics of life, a politics of life. At the same time as we can't just take up every issue all the time, we also, as I say, have to try and get the most progressive government that we can and work out how the hell we're going to move forward, particularly in what looks like an extraordinarily challenging future. I hope I answered
Thank you everybody for coming and participating. That was great. We always have drinks at the end of these, and everybody is welcome. From this venue, it's the Tavistock Hotel, which is turned right out the front doors, and it's over on the left across the square. They have a big bar there. I'm right about that, aren't I? Yes. Thank you very, very much. One other quick thing. Anybody who was at the last talk, which was about the women's strike in Leeds, the clothing workers' strike, the film Leeds United, which we showed a little bit of, has been put on Vimeo very kindly by Andy. It's not very good quality, but it's there if people want to see it, the whole film. Thanks again. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you.
Well done, Lynn. That was well done. Yeah, there was a lot of questions at the end, wasn't it? Very well done. I have to tell you, I never do. Royal Film for those. Oh, yeah, I mean, that's funny. And we lived in one of the lands for 2 years. So, oh my God. Oh my God. So that's where I came into Britain. That was a great contribution, Jane.
Lynn, I would be nice to have a drink, but I've got to rush.
Okay.